There is a deeply damaging misconception about empaths that causes people to underestimate them. The moment someone sees a gentle, compassionate person, they often assume that person must be weak. When they encounter someone with extraordinary patience, they mistake that patience for permission to cross boundaries. And when an empath forgives, people can interpret that forgiveness as surrender, believing they can continue hurting them without ever facing consequences. But kindness is not blindness. Choosing peace does not mean an empath is unaware of what is happening around them. In fact, many empaths notice far more than they reveal. Their calm exterior can hide an incredibly sharp awareness of human behavior. They may see the manipulation, recognize the disrespect, understand the hidden motives, and still choose not to react immediately. That is where people make their greatest mistake. An empath is not fragile simply because they feel things deeply. Their emotional depth can actually become one of their greatest sources of strength. They regularly process intense emotions, absorb difficult experiences, and carry psychological weight that many people would struggle to handle. They can endure tremendous amounts of pain while still trying to understand, forgive, and preserve the relationship. But every person has a limit. When you repeatedly push an empath beyond that limit, something inside them can change permanently. And what makes this transformation so powerful is that it usually does not arrive through a dramatic confrontation. There may be no screaming, no explosive argument, and no desperate attempt to make you understand their pain. Instead, everything becomes strangely quiet. The warmth disappears. The emotional openness begins to fade. The person who once cared deeply about explaining themselves may suddenly stop trying. The energy of the relationship changes, and you may feel a distance that was not there before. It can almost seem as if an invisible door has closed between you. The most significant shift happens when the empath no longer feels the need to fight for recognition. They are no longer trying to convince you to understand them. They are no longer waiting for an apology, chasing clarity, or demanding that you finally acknowledge what you did. They simply detach. And that is often far more final than anger. Anger still contains emotional investment. Anger means a person still cares enough to fight, argue, or seek acknowledgement. Detachment is different. It happens when someone has exhausted their emotional resources and decides that protecting their inner peace matters more than preserving a connection that repeatedly wounds them. This ability to detach does not come from nowhere. Empaths often spend years observing people closely. They become highly attentive to changes in behavior, emotional patterns, and the subtle signals most people overlook. Even when they appear silent, they may be processing an enormous amount of information internally. They notice the hesitation in someone's voice. They recognize when affection suddenly feels forced. They sense when a compliment carries hidden disrespect. They can observe when someone's behavior contradicts their promises. They may even recognize manipulation when it has been carefully disguised as concern, love, or kindness. Their sensitivity allows them to detect inconsistencies between what someone says and what they actually do. That is why an empath's silence should never automatically be interpreted as ignorance. Sometimes silence means they are watching, sometimes it means they are processing, and sometimes it means they already understand exactly what is happening but are waiting to see whether you will reveal the truth through your own actions. An empath may remain quiet because they are giving you an opportunity to correct yourself without being forced. They may hope that if they give you enough space, you will eventually become honest, take responsibility, and make the right choice on your own. This period of silence can be a final form of grace. They are not necessarily unaware of the lies, broken promises, contradictions, or emotional games. They may be noticing all of it and quietly putting the pieces together. Every repeated disappointment becomes another piece of evidence. Every broken promise adds another layer to their understanding. Every manipulation teaches them something about the person standing in front of them, and eventually the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. When the same behavior continues despite repeated opportunities to change, the empath's priorities can shift dramatically. At first, they may be focused on saving the relationship. They may ask themselves how they can communicate better, love more patiently, forgive more completely, or help the other person understand the damage being caused. But after enough pain, the question changes. They stop asking, "How can I save this connection?" They start asking, "How can I protect my peace?" That is the moment everything begins to change. Because when an empath has finally recognized that their compassion is being exploited, they may stop offering unlimited access to it. Their boundaries become stronger. Their tolerance becomes more selective. Their emotional availability is no longer something another person can assume they will always receive. And perhaps the most misunderstood part of this process is that an empath's decision to detach does not necessarily mean they stopped caring. Sometimes it means they cared for far too long. They gave chances. They explained themselves. They forgave. They waited. They hoped the person would change. They carried the emotional burden of the connection until carrying it became more painful than releasing it. So when an empath finally walks away emotionally, do not assume that their silence means they never understood what happened. They may have understood it long before you realized they were watching. Their quietness was not weakness. Their patience was not permission. Their forgiveness was not surrender. It was simply the final space they gave you to choose differently. And when that opportunity is repeatedly wasted, the empath may eventually choose themselves, not through revenge, not through destruction, but through something much more powerful: complete emotional detachment and the decision to never again sacrifice their peace just to keep someone else comfortable. At first, an empath's natural response to being hurt is usually to understand rather than escape. They will communicate with patience, explain what they are feeling, identify exactly where the pain is coming from, and make a genuine effort to repair what has been damaged. Instead of immediately walking away, they ask questions. They try to understand the reasons behind the behavior and look for some explanation that might make the situation easier to process. This is because emotionally aware people tend to search for solutions before they accept that a relationship may need to end. They want to close the emotional distance, repair the broken trust, and bring the connection back to a healthier place. They may continue giving opportunities because they can recognize the wounds, insecurities, and potential hidden beneath another person's destructive behavior, but compassion has limits. No amount of empathy can remain healthy when it is continuously surrounded by dishonesty and emotional abuse. When an empath repeatedly communicates openly only to receive lies, gaslighting, manipulation, or deliberate emotional games in return, something eventually reaches its breaking point. The mind begins to understand that kindness is no longer being received as kindness, it is being exploited. And once that realization becomes impossible to ignore, the empath may begin protecting themselves in a completely different way. Instead of continuing to react emotionally to every hurtful action, they start withdrawing their emotional energy. They stop explaining. They stop defending themselves. They stop trying to convince the other person to understand. From the outside, this sudden silence can easily be misunderstood. Someone may think they finally calmed down, everything is normal again, but that assumption can be dangerously wrong. There is a major difference between genuine emotional peace and emotional shutdown. Healthy peace still contains warmth. It allows openness, connection, trust, and emotional availability. A person who has found peace can still care deeply and communicate honestly. Emotional shutdown is something else entirely. It is a protective response. It creates distance where closeness has become unsafe. Instead of opening the door to deeper connection, the person builds an internal boundary designed to prevent further emotional damage. And once an empath stops pouring their tears, attention, energy, and emotional effort into a destructive relationship, the connection can begin disappearing without a dramatic ending. There may be no final confrontation, no huge argument, no spectacular moment where everything falls apart. The relationship simply becomes emotionally empty. This is also where the dynamic with a manipulative person can change dramatically. Manipulation often depends on emotional access. A person who constantly provokes arguments, creates confusion, demands explanations, insults someone, or repeatedly challenges their character may be looking for an emotional response because that response tells them they still have influence. The crying, arguing, defending, pleading, and desperate attempts to be understood can all become evidence that the other person is still emotionally invested. As long as the reaction continues, the manipulator may feel powerful. But when the empath stops reacting, that source of emotional control begins to disappear. Suddenly, the manipulator cannot predict what will happen next. The tactics that once produced tears may produce nothing. The accusations that once triggered long explanations may be met with silence. The provocations that once created emotional chaos may simply receive no response. That uncertainty can be extremely uncomfortable for someone who has become accustomed to controlling the emotional atmosphere. This is why a person who relies on manipulation may intensify their behavior when they sense that their influence is disappearing. They may become more hostile, provoke stronger arguments, create unnecessary emergencies, deliver insults, or suddenly become extremely emotional, all in an attempt to bring back the reaction they used to receive. They are looking for proof that they still have access. But an empath who is truly detached may no longer provide it. At that point, the empath is no longer trying to prove their worth to the person who hurt them. They are no longer desperate for an apology. They are no longer obsessed with making the other person understand their perspective. Most importantly, they stop measuring their value according to how someone else treats or perceives them. Their validation begins coming from within, and that internal shift is incredibly powerful. When you no longer need someone's approval to feel worthy, their manipulation becomes much harder to use against you. When you no longer need them to understand your pain, their refusal to understand loses much of its power. When you stop needing closure from the person who created the confusion, you begin creating closure for yourself. Pain can become a harsh teacher. Every betrayal teaches something. Every broken promise reveals a pattern. Every repeated cycle of mistreatment provides information about what a person is willing to do when they believe there will be no consequences. An empath may begin life giving people the benefit of the doubt. They naturally look beyond someone's mistakes and search for the good underneath them. They see potential where others may only see flaws. They often believe that patience, love, and understanding can help someone become a healthier version of themselves. But repeated experiences can change that perspective. After enough betrayal, the empath becomes more observant. They begin recognizing patterns instead of isolated incidents. They stop judging behavior only by promises and start watching consistency. Words become less important than actions. Apologies become less meaningful when the same behavior keeps returning. This does not mean they become cruel. It means they become discerning. They can still have compassion without giving unlimited access to their life. They can understand someone's wounds without volunteering to be wounded by them. They can forgive without reopening the same door. And they can love someone while recognizing that distance is necessary for their own peace. That is the transformation people often fail to notice. The empath does not necessarily become colder. They become wiser about where their warmth belongs. They stop dismissing the warning signs they once tried to excuse. They no longer waste their energy explaining their feelings to someone who has already decided to misunderstand them. And perhaps most importantly, they stop searching for closure from the very person who caused the wound. They finally understand that closure does not require a confession, an apology, or an admission of guilt from a manipulative person. Sometimes closure begins the moment you accept what happened and stop waiting for someone else to give you permission to move forward. They also stop trying to rescue people who repeatedly choose destructive behavior. An empath can recognize someone's pain without taking responsibility for healing it. They eventually realize that some people are deeply attached to their own unhealthy patterns, and no amount of compassion can transform someone who has no genuine desire to change. This realization can create a profound shift in the relationship. People often become accustomed to the emotional security an empath provides. They know there is someone who will listen without immediately judging them, someone who will offer support during difficult moments, someone who will forgive mistakes that others might never tolerate. Over time, that kind of emotional availability can begin to feel permanent, and that is where the problem begins. When someone receives patience, understanding, and forgiveness repeatedly, they may start treating those qualities as if they are unlimited. They stop recognizing them as gifts and begin assuming they are entitlements. They become comfortable knowing that no matter how badly they behave, the empath will eventually return with compassion. But compassion is not an endless resource. When the empath finally withdraws, the difference can be shocking. The warmth disappears, the listening disappears, the constant reassurance is gone. The emotional safety that once seemed automatic is suddenly unavailable, and the person who took it for granted may suddenly realize how much they depended on it. They can feel unsettled, anxious, and emotionally exposed because they are now facing situations without the person who used to absorb so much of the emotional pressure. What they once considered ordinary may suddenly feel incredibly valuable because its absence reveals its true importance. This is one reason people can experience regret after seriously hurting an empath. That regret does not necessarily come from revenge or punishment. A truly detached empath is often no longer interested in making the other person suffer. They do not need elaborate revenge plans because they have already decided that their peace is more valuable than retaliation. The regret comes from absence. When the empath was present, they may have been quietly reducing the emotional consequences of situations that were never actually theirs to carry. They listened when no one else would. They offered reassurance when someone felt lost. They brought stability into emotional chaos and provided warmth during periods of loneliness. In many relationships, the empath may have been carrying far more emotional responsibility than anyone realized. They absorbed tension, they softened conflicts, they made excuses, they tried to understand both sides. They repeatedly created emotional space for another person's problems while minimizing their own. And because they did it so naturally, nobody noticed how much work was happening beneath the surface. Then one day they stop. They put down the emotional burden they were never meant to carry alone and step away. Suddenly, the atmosphere changes. The person who remains behind has to experience the relationship without the emotional buffer the empath once provided. Problems that were previously softened become obvious. Loneliness becomes harder to avoid. Emotional instability can no longer be redirected towards someone who is always willing to absorb it. The absence becomes a mirror. It reveals exactly what the empath had been contributing all along. This is also where profound emotional pain can create a different kind of intelligence. Someone who has survived repeated betrayal does not necessarily become heartless. They become more observant. They begin recognizing patterns they once overlooked. They can distinguish between genuine kindness and kindness that is being strategically performed. They notice who constantly takes emotional energy without giving anything meaningful in return. They recognize people who use vulnerability to gain sympathy, only to weaponize that sympathy later. They become more cautious around individuals whose words sound beautiful, but whose behavior repeatedly tells a completely different story. The empath begins studying consistency rather than promises. They watch what happens when someone is frustrated. They notice how that person treats people who cannot offer them anything. They observe whether apologies are followed by changed behavior or simply used to reset the cycle. They pay attention to whether affection disappears whenever they establish a boundary. These observations gradually make manipulation much harder to hide. Charm loses some of its power. Empty promises stop creating excitement. Grand declarations mean very little when everyday behavior contradicts them. The empath has learned that a person's character is revealed less by what they claim to be and more by what they repeatedly do. That lesson can completely transform their relationships. They can remain compassionate without being easily accessible. They can forgive without forgetting the pattern. They can understand someone's trauma without allowing that trauma to become an excuse for mistreatment. And this is where emotional maturity becomes something far more powerful than simple sensitivity. It becomes discernment. Their strength is no longer loud. They do not need to dominate conversations, prove that they are right, or announce that they have changed. They simply become much harder to manipulate. Their boundaries speak for them. Their silence becomes intentional. Their absence becomes a decision rather than a reaction. And their peace no longer depends on whether another person finally understands their value. That is the quiet authority an empath develops after surviving enough emotional pain. It is not aggression. It is not cruelty. It is not the desire to control anyone else. It is self-control. The deepest feelers can eventually become some of the most perceptive observers because suffering forces them to study what they once trusted blindly. They learn to recognize patterns, protect their energy, and choose carefully who deserves access to their emotional world. They do not lose their empathy. They finally learn where to place it. This is the kind of strength that no longer depends on anyone else's approval. It does not need constant reassurance, validation, or recognition. It is the quiet confidence of someone who has finally learned that they can leave a toxic situation without defending their decision or explaining themselves to the person who created the pain. An empath's emotional shutdown rarely happens because of one bad day or a temporary argument. It is usually the result of prolonged emotional exhaustion. When someone experiences repeated disrespect, betrayal, disappointment, and one-sided emotional effort for a long period of time, eventually their entire approach to the relationship can change. Their mind begins prioritizing protection over connection. Once that emotional distance becomes firmly established, getting the relationship back to what it once was can be extremely difficult. A simple apology may not be enough. Promises to change may no longer carry any weight. Even beautiful memories from the past may fail to reopen a door that has already been closed. The reason is simple. The empath is no longer evaluating you based on what you say today. They are remembering what you consistently did yesterday. They remember the patterns. They remember the contradictions. They remember how often your actions failed to match your promises. So when you suddenly become desperate to repair everything after they have withdrawn, they may not interpret that urgency as proof of love. They may see it as a reaction to losing access to them. Deeply damaged trust cannot be repaired through words alone. When someone has repeatedly broken the emotional foundation of a relationship, Eventually, there may be nothing solid left for new promises to stand on. That is why panic often appears when the other person finally realizes the empath is genuinely leaving. They may think, they forgave me before, they will forgive me again. They remember all the previous chances and assume another one is guaranteed. They tell themselves that they simply need to wait for the emotions to settle, give the empath some space, and eventually everything will return to normal. But they misunderstand what has happened. The empath may have already reached a completely different emotional destination. Even if circumstances force them to remain connected because of family, responsibilities, shared commitments, or practical reasons, their emotional presence may no longer be what it once was. They can still be respectful. They can still communicate. They can still behave with maturity. But the warmth is different. The deep emotional openness may be gone. The nurturing energy may disappear. Conversations may become polite but distant. What once felt intimate can begin feeling formal and carefully controlled. It is important to remember that empaths are still human beings. They have limits. Their compassion is not an unlimited resource, and they are not designed to absorb endless mistreatment simply because they understand where another person's pain comes from. As emotional maturity develops, tolerance for manipulation often decreases. They begin recognizing the difference between love and control. Love creates safety. Manipulation takes advantage of patience. Love respects boundaries. Manipulation becomes angry when boundaries appear. And once someone has intentionally destroyed a sense of emotional safety, rebuilding it cannot be accomplished through pressure or performance. You cannot purchase trust back. You cannot manufacture genuine safety with carefully chosen words, and you certainly cannot force another person to feel secure with you again. The empath eventually discovers something incredibly important. They can survive without the person who hurt them. An empath eventually learns to turn the love they gave away back toward themselves. While others may only recognize their value after losing them, the empath has often been grieving silently for months. They cried, reflected, questioned, and slowly released the relationship long before they physically walked away. So their final departure may look sudden, but it rarely is. They leave without revenge or hatred, choosing healing, peace, and people who genuinely value their compassion.